Salibas graduated magna cum laude from SMU with a BA in Public Policy, a BS in Economics with Financial Applications, and cum laude for his BBA in Finance. He served at the George W. Bush Institute in research and analytical capacities and is now at the McGuire Institute. He has been published 7 times in his young career, focusing on the shale boom and infrastructure. Mr. Salibas is an avid swimmer and served proudly as part of SMU's dominant swimming and diving program. Welcome him.
Thank you. Everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. I hope everyone enjoyed lunch and hope you're ready for panel 3 of the symposium entitled Man in the Middle. Before I begin, I'd like to introduce my esteemed panelists. To my right, I have Brad Ayers. Brad is the Director, Government Relations for TransCanada. He is the primary state and federal government relations contact for 9 states along the Keystone XL and A&R pipeline routes. Prior to this, Brad worked for Encana Oil and Gas in Dallas and served as president of Legislative Initiatives, LLC in Washington, D.C. Brad earned a Bachelor of Public Administration from the University of Mississippi in 1998 and holds a professional graduate certificate of practice in corporate citizenship from Boston College. To Brad's right, we have Matt Most. Matt is the Vice President of Government Relations for the USA for Encana Oil and Gas. Matt's team is responsible for key U.S. policy initiatives and government relationships for Encana Oil and Gas, Inc. Previously, Matt led Encana Natural Gas, providing compressed and liquefied natural gas fueling solutions to a variety of industries. Matt holds a bachelor's degree from Clark University in Environmental Sciences and a Master in Business Administration from Babson College. To Matt's right, we have Michael Burdett. Michael is Senior Vice President of Commercial for EnLink Midstream. He joined EnLink's Midstream's predecessor, Crosstex Energy, in 2004 and has 30 years of domestic and international experience in the oil and gas industry in the area of marketing and commercial transactions. Mr. Burdett has led several commercial functions at EnLink Midstream, including responsibility for North Texas, West Texas, and LIG business units. He has also served as the asset team lead for various company pipeline systems. Mr. Burdett holds a BBA in Marketing and Finance from SMU. Well, with that, I think it's time to jump on into the panel. Like I said, this is the Man in the Middle panel. And in the oil and gas industry, as we know, the man in the middle is the midstream sector. And the midstream sector is active in every part from the time the hydrocarbons come out of the ground to the time they reach market. And what this includes is the storage, processing, and transportation of oil and gas. And in terms of transportation, that can be pipeline, it can be rail car, it could be barge, or it could be tanker. And I think during the course of our discussion, we're going to explore what would be the most efficient and the best way to transport oil and gas and what the infrastructure needs are in North America as we look toward the future of uncertain commodity prices. So with that being said, earlier today we've heard about this dramatic drop in commodity prices over the past year. We've seen how producers in shale plays are taking rigs offline. We've seen about a 50% drop in the U.S. rig count in the past few months. We've also seen that service companies are laying off workers, cutting rates. But what we haven't heard about so far is the effect on the midstream sector. And what I'd like to know is the midstream sector as affected as these other components of the oil and gas industry, or due to the unique structure of many midstream companies, are you somewhat insulated from volatility in commodity prices? I think I'd like to start with Michael.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I don't think there's any producer or midstreamer that isn't affected right now by the commodity environment. And most of that impact is due to the dramatic decline in the rig activity. So what does that affect? I mean, it affects, if projects have just been put into service, the slowdown in drilling activity is going to delay the ramp up in the volume that's going to run through those pipes or those facilities. So that's the primary impact you're going to see from the midstream sector. In addition, if you've got projects that you're trying to kick off, the contracting associated with supporting that infrastructure is clearly going to be a lot more difficult until you see prices rebound. You're going to have to take a lot more care in your contracting practices. So no one's immune. Everyone's affected. I think it's important to note, though, that some companies are structured better to weather the storm. And speaking about EnLink in particular, fortunately, we're set up in a way that we've got very stable cash flows. We've got a strong balance sheet. We've got a diverse asset footprint. We operate in a lot of different basins, some of the most active basins. I know Tim Dove this morning talked about the Permian. We're in the Permian, and specifically we're in the heart of the Midland Basin, which is still a very active area. We're solidly in the Barnett. Drilling activity in the Barnett is very low right now, but there's a lot of opportunities in that area for us to work on consolidations and potential acquisitions and things of that nature. We're in the Oklahoma, in the Cana-Woodford, where we've got good drilling activity going on in that area. And then just across the board, we've got great asset footprint in Louisiana. So we've got, from an infrastructure standpoint, we've got the demand side. And I'll touch on more things. I won't hog the microphone the whole time, but I just say it's important to note that the stability of cash flows, a strong balance sheet, is going to help companies that are set up properly to kind of make it through until prices do turn around.
Right, and playing off of that, do you see increased M&A activity in the midstream sector in the next few months, or?
I would say generally you're going to see a steady flow of acquisition M&A activity, either by someone. We're focused on making acquisitions. We're going to be disciplined in our approach. Just this past quarter, we closed on several acquisitions. We acquired some Gulf Coast assets from Chevron, most notably the Bridgeline pipeline system in southern Louisiana. We acquired a couple of companies out in the Permian Basin. One was a crude logistics company called LPC, and we acquired Coronado's assets, which happened to fit really well with the infrastructure, the organic infrastructure that we built in our Bearcat facility and our high-pressure trunk lines. And we also have been fortunate enough to affect a transfer of assets or a drop down from Devon, who is our 70% owner of our general partnership in the Eagle Ford. It's the Victoria Express pipeline, and that was real exciting.
Okay, well, thank you. Moving to more of a regulatory and a public policy perspective, earlier today we heard from the Honorable Christy Craddock that the United States only has 40% of the pipeline infrastructure that we need moving forward. And when you look back to 2008, we've seen a 5,000% increase in the amount of crude oil moving by rail in this country. And at the same time, you're seeing that in different regional areas, commodity prices experience a significant discount to national benchmarks due to a lack of takeaway capacity. If you look in the Appalachian Basin, where we have the Utica Shale and the Marcellus Shale, many gas producers in that area are seeing that they have to take about a 50% discount to Henry Hub gas prices due to a lack of regional infrastructure to get their gas to market. So along those lines, I'd like to toss it over to Brad and ask, how much pipeline infrastructure does North America need, and how can we assure that even in a time of low commodity prices like we are in, that infrastructure gets built for the future?
Well, Nick, right now I would say we need about 1,200 miles, and it needs to stretch from the Hardesty Terminal in Alberta down to Steel City, Nebraska. That would be, that's where I would start. It's just about right? And, that was an interesting number that Chairwoman Craddock gave us because, we have, as a company, $34 billion more in addition to Keystone pipelines on the drawing board. Granted, they're still subject to regulatory approval, but those, we're willing to build those, and we have plans to build those. Just recently, we announced it's only a 9-mile pipeline, but with Magellan out of Oklahoma. We're going to, from our terminal in Houston, we're going to connect to one of their terminals to get that will benefit both companies, and that's a $50 million project. So we're committed to continuing to build, and yes, the more pipelines, the better.
Well, what about the debate of pipeline versus rail? With this increase in rail, we've seen some accidents in Canada, Quebec notably a couple years ago. Is it safer to transport rail by pipeline, or to transport oil and gas by pipeline rather than rail?
No, Nick, of course not. I was watching Rachel Maddow last night, which may be a first, but our dinner went so long last night that it's about the only thing I could find on. So I got in there, and she pointed out, and she had the pictures, the visuals going, had five explosions this year. So we're averaging one rail car explosion a month at this rate.
Wow.
So no, there's always going to be a place for rail to transport. I believe you can have it both ways, you know, a strategy that benefits all of North America, not just the U.S., but the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. You know, that is a part of it. We can truly go out and have it both ways. But I'll say this about rail, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with what the ag interests, with the issues they're facing. You know, farmers can't get their crops to market because the rail industry makes a lot more money moving crude than they do moving corn. So crops are rotting in the field, and we've been working to get the ag interest on board and coming up with a way to address that. But yes, there's room for both of them. We believe that pipe, though, is without a question the safest.
Speaking of public policy, we heard in the previous panel about the need for a North American energy policy and for cooperation between these three nations that have huge resources of oil and gas. What role does midstream specifically play in the North American integrated energy market? And what needs to be done to strengthen that relationship? Matt?
That's for me, huh?
Well, we've got two representatives from Canadian companies on this panel, so I think
I'm truly the man in the middle here.
you are the man in the middle.
So as an upstream player, we very much rely on the midstream community to help us be successful in our business. You know, when I look at our portfolio over the years, we had quite a strong amount of midstream investment in the portfolio earlier on in my 5 years within Canada. And those assets were largely done in order to get the resource out of the ground that we needed. And over time, we were not able to hold on to those assets. We divested of them because midstream assets just don't fit very well in our portfolio in terms of the rate of returns and the risk profiles of midstream assets versus the upstream assets that we hold. So we, as of now, don't hold much by way of midstream assets. But one thing we've learned is that as we go into this low commodity price environment, the flexibility of those midstream agreements that we do have, those long-term agreements, can be quite challenging. And we've really tried to focus on shorter-term agreements in recent years in order to allow us to have the flexibility to move from resource to resource as our portfolios needed to change as the market has changed around us. So it's a real challenge to find the right partnerships where you can find the win-win with a midstream player that allows you to have the flexibility you need, but also get the capacity, the takeaway capacity you need in a certain area. And as far as North America, you know, connecting North America and making this the energy superpower that it every way should be between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, midstream is really the key to all of that. Being able to move these commodities freely between refining hubs and markets from their upstream sources in a very flexible way as basis changes, as market changes, and as policy changes. You know, obviously the crude export ban that was discussed in the fantastic opening to the conference today is exactly the type of thing that can have dramatic impacts on the flows of commodities around North America and off of our shores. So midstream is what stitches all that together. And it allows us in the upstream to be successful in what we're doing and be able to be flexible and agile and be able to go from resource to resource as we find better and better places to drill lower and lower cost oil and gas.
And Matt, can you elaborate a bit upon your company's decision to pivot from being a gas player to mostly a liquids player, and what caused that? Yeah,
so the Encana story, or really Encana 3.0, I like to think of it as, you know, if you go back to 2009, 2008, that was when Encana split at that point from being a integrated company at that point to being two companies. So Cenovus became the oil-centric company with no ownership tie to Encana, which became a very, very focused natural gas company. And at that point in 2008, that strategy seemed very, very solid. So Encana became, the company I joined, became a 96% dry gas producer, and one of the largest in the US and Canada combined. I think at that point was the second largest gas producer after ExxonMobil. And the company's strategy at that point was to double down, so a 5-year double production, so a very strong growth curve. And unfortunately, you know, the fall of gas prices made that strategy unsustainable, and that became clear over the next couple of years. Whereas in 2013, we had a management change towards the beginning of the year, and a very, very extensive strategic review over that entire year, and resulted in some very, very painful decisions, really reaching the conclusion that to be successful in this industry, we needed to have a foot both in the natural gas and the liquids markets. So in 2014, we made some very significant divestitures. We sold about $10 billion worth of primarily dry gas assets, including the largest energy IPO ever done in Canada to sell off our fee lands, as well as the Jonah Field in Wyoming, our East Texas assets, and a very, very significant consolidation in our overhead, where we had about 25% reduction in headcount, and we consolidated a lot of our offices, including at that point was our nicest and one of our most high-tech offices here in Plano. And that brings us to where we are today, where we took that $10 billion of assets and we refocused it on liquids plays, investing it entirely in the Permian and the Eagle Ford. As a result, today we're about 80-20 in terms of our production, so about 20% of our production is liquids and 80% gas, and that liquids portion is growing quite quickly. We're not drilling any gas wells today. We're drilling, virtually all of our capital is focused on growing the liquid side of the portfolio. So the transformation continues, but one of the comments I wanted to share today was, you know, when we were reevaluating the portfolio, it was really important to understand that every asset in that portfolio, and prior to 2013, we were drilling in over 25 different locations. Every capital play had to compete in order to be in the portfolio going forward. And it's really important that Texas was the place where we decided to focus virtually all of our U.S. activity, which is more than half of the company's cash flow, comes out of the Eagle Ford and the Permian, and that was because of the unique mix of strategic attributes you find here in Texas, whether it be world-class resource, world-class access to markets, largely due to the midstream players up here and others that are active in Texas, the market price, you know, to be close to the markets where you can get premium prices, and an accommodative regulatory environment, candidly a market where we're wanted and the business community embraces us. So Texas wins. Texas has been a very, very strong competitor amongst the many other states and provinces where we operate, and a big part of where we're banking our success on going forward.
Thank you, and I think I'll toss it back maybe to Brad, and we can all, you brought up Keystone XL. What kind of benefits would North America see if Keystone were to be approved? And I think the question everyone wants to know is, well, where do we stand right now? How does TransCanada feel?
Well, man in the middle to us means President Obama. And we know that President Obama has 624 days left in office, about 14,972 hours. And
But who's counting?
Yeah, but who's counting? But you know, even the president's own State Department's indicated that if construction started tomorrow, if I got an email saying, hey, he signed the permit, we would have 9,000 jobs, construction jobs, that would start tomorrow. And that doesn't mean, that's not our figure, that's the Department of State's figure. In the many volumes we have answered questions to. As for where it stands, you wouldn't believe the documents in our DC office where we've provided documentation written, but just the sheer volume. I mean, it's thicker than the Bible, but doesn't have any of the good news in it. It's really it's really just I can't figure it out. You know, we've got the International Brotherhood of Teamsters Union, you've got the AFL-CIO, the Pipeline Contractors Association, you've got the Union of Operating Engineers, about 3 other unions that we've entered into project labor agreements with who support this project. This president at this point hasn't indicated that he's going to do anything but let the process play out. We have issues in Nebraska over the constitutionality of the governor at the time, Governor Dave Heineman, who approved the pipeline route, but now there's issues raised by opponents of the pipeline that he didn't have the constitutional authority. So even though 90% of the easements have been agreed upon in the state between our company and landowners, we're going to hold off until the constitutionality question's answered before we go forward on that. So that's kind of where it stands. I would like to tell you we're going to get something done before the end of this administration, but we just keep working it.
What's amazing is that Keystone is just one pipeline, and what we've heard today is that North America needs more than just one pipeline. And specifically, if we start getting into the business of exporting LNG, what kind of infrastructure, what kind of investments are we looking at in terms of not just the export facilities, but across the North America? What kind of infrastructure needs to be in place for that to happen?
You know what? Without getting into specifics there, I will say this, just as the former lobbyist in me and congressional staffer, you know, and everybody in the audience, this is your chance if you ask, what can I do practically to influence American energy policy? Every 12 to 13, 14 years in the country, we have an overarching energy policy act. It's called the Energy Policy Act. Well, Chairman Fred Upton is going to come out with that one here. He's going to start issuing parcels of it that'll probably make it as trial balloons that'll come out of the committee at some point later this year. But it addresses 3, and I wrote them down just to make sure I included them because they're very important. And I would encourage you as voters and as people who have company representatives who are lobbyists, Chairman Upton is going to push for modernizing our infrastructure. He's going to establish a framework for how we can use energy as a diplomatic tool around the world, and perhaps more importantly, or most importantly, for a lot of us who deal with the government, that's going to be to clarify the role of the government in areas of efficiency and accountability. If you have issues with PHMSA, this is your chance to let your elected officials know how you'd like to see those addressed. So I would say pay attention to that in the coming months as to how, when you ask for what infrastructure could be in place, this is the time period to get involved in that process and let your voices be heard.
Well, thank you, Brad. And
Nicholas, can I add to that?
yes, please.
So that's really the right tone to set on so many issues that we're dealing with, you know, whether it's crude export or it's Keystone or it's any of these issues. It's amazing how effective engagement from voters is into the process. Crude export is one I've been working on a lot lately, so it's one that happens to be freshest in my mind, but they're all the same. In order for our elected officials in Washington to move on these things, particularly the ones who don't see things the way you do, they need to hear from you. They need to understand that if they take a courageous vote, that they've got people behind them. And a lot of them understand things like Keystone or crude export are no-brainers and need to be done. But what's keeping them from taking the appropriate action is understanding that there are constituents behind them that see it that way. And we hear this all the time. We hear that, you know, I understand what you're saying. This makes a lot of sense, but I need to be comfortable that there's enough folks who understand this back home and are with me. And we remind people that everywhere we go, because that engagement makes our jobs a lot easier in order to get the right policy in place.
Yeah, with all that, though, I mean, it's a lot of effort, it's a lot of time and energy. I mean, if the infrastructure need is really that great, I mean, then you've got to do a lot of legwork because you've got projects to plan and long lead items to purchase and air permits and, core permits and things of that nature. So having that extra regulatory hurdle is really a burden, so.
Well, you can't build a pipeline overnight. And how do you get the message out there that commodity prices may be depressed right now, but no one knows what the future holds, and that we need to invest in this infrastructure now in order to be ready 5-10 years down the line? And it seems like policy is doing more right now to get in the way of that rather than encourage that level of foresight. I guess along those lines, I have one little follow-up question. For the midstream, would you say that the biggest uncertainty, what would be the biggest uncertainty for your business? If it's not commodity prices, is it policy?
In order,
Go ahead.
start with the biggest uncertainty.
Why don't you start first and I'll agree or disagree?
We have about a 1,200-mile uncertainty. That's probably my biggest uncertainty is possibly what the next, if Secretary Clinton were elected the next president, what her position would be. We certainly are optimistic that she would also approve a pipeline. I mean, this is going to be the safest, most studied pipeline built in American history. And that would be my biggest uncertainty.
I do agree. No, I think if you look at it from our perspective, I think an uncertainty, I don't know if it's the biggest uncertainty, but it would be just how long will this commodity environment be where it is before we see a significant change that will, in either oil and or gas prices, that will increase that activity, that will then allow you to move forward more quickly on development of the infrastructure that's needed. The demand side is going to pull and really create the need to get the last miles of pipe to the markets. And the drain or the drag is going to be the supply side not being, people not being confident to actually put forward that infrastructure without the proper contracting behind it. So as I mentioned, we are fortunate in that we've got most of our cash flow is stable because we've got long-term fixed fee contracts with a lot of minimum volume commitments. When producers are uncertain about prices and therefore uncertain about their volume forecast, it's going to be very difficult to match up the demands from a midstreamer and a producer from time to time in order to get that long-term contract that Matt was talking about. So you've got to have that nice blend of, yeah, I see this works well for both of us in order to get that infrastructure built in a quick fashion.
Just to add to that, when we make our capital decisions on where we're going to invest, the regulatory certainty and the comfort around the regulatory environment has become a very big issue for us. Our U.S. headquarters is in Colorado. We had very significant Colorado operations and spent a lot of time trying to operate in the Colorado environment and have been concerned that the sustainability of that market is very questionable based on some of the political forces at work there. We've worked very hard to try to keep Colorado open and keep it favorable for business. But that's a cautionary tale of how important it is to maintain a favorable regulatory environment and putting the appropriate amount of effort into engaging with the community so that they understand the ups and downs of our business and that they understand the positive impacts we have in the economy and all the effort that goes into maintaining the safety and the environmental protections to what we do so that we get ahead of issues, we understand the needs and concerns of the community, and we're hopefully being far enough ahead of that they don't turn into regulatory problems. This carries on to the federal level. So regulatory uncertainty is a big issue when you're making long-term investments. But one of the things that's interesting about the upstream business versus the midstream business is that we invest in a field and we largely get a return of and on our investment in a well within 2-3 years based on the decline curve of the product that we're producing. So you get most of the product up front, you get most of the revenues up front in the current period, and you're not taking a present value of revenues long out into the future. And that does create a little bit of a different perspective on risk than you may have, I would imagine, in the midstream space, where you have to have many, many years, maybe a decade or more, to receive a return of and on your investment. So I would imagine regulatory uncertainty becomes an even bigger deal in the midstream space than it may be for upstream producers, and it's a huge deal for us.
So I think the consensus is that policy, rather than market forces, is the biggest concern for the midstream sector.
Yeah, for us, it might be a photo finish between the two. We cannot operate our business without either of them.
I think I had one more question before we turn it over to the audience. And there's been talk, and I've seen articles recently about the U.S. is running out of space to store our crude oil, since we've seen this rapid production and we haven't seen a commensurate increase in demand. My question would be, number one, are we running out of space? Number two, what would happen if we did run out of space?
I could take a crack at that one.
Okay.
Yeah, we are at record high levels of storage for crude oil. This year, that largely has to do with the fact that we've got this increasing production at a time of refinery turnaround. So refiners are going through their seasonal changeouts. They're not buying as much oil as they would typically. But if we were to continue growing production, particularly of the light crudes, at the rate that we are, next year or years in the future, this will become more and more of a rather seasonal fixture, a permanent fixture. So the challenge of us producing crudes here in the States that aren't in demand by refineries here has to be addressed through export efficiencies. This is what every other market does. We don't intend to produce Chevrolets here for every driver and not import Volkswagens. We recognize that there are different products for different markets. It's no different in our business. So until we can access the appropriate market for the product we're producing, we're going to be bumping up against that cap on exports. What would happen if we don't address it? I shudder to think of what the implications would be if it got much worse than it is. The market solution will be to discount the product dramatically, which will shut off activity in our space. It's the only solution. There's other than building more storage, which is actually happening now, it's really no other solution. It's really pretty simple.
And it's really not practical to convert the refineries that are refining the heavier crudes to take in the light crudes that need to find a home, so, in a reasonable time frame.
Well, do any of the panelists have anything to add on really any topic? If not, I think we will turn over to the audience for Q&A.
Brad, how did TransCanada Pipeline, one pipeline, become like a national referendum on energy policy and environment? How did you all ever envision what it would grow to in the public sphere with it being, one pipeline?
I don't think we ever envisioned it would become, you have such organization in the state of Nebraska. It's a group called Bold Nebraska. I won't mention their names, but they're a persistent bunch. And I was sitting next to one of them at a hearing out in the state Senate. She didn't realize I was with TransCanada, but she started telling me this. I'll even clean her language up here for you today, but she points out to me the TransCanada guy testifying and tells me how evil he is, and she tells me that what they're going to do, and they're not telling these landowners this, is they're going to take their land and they're going to say they're going to put one pipeline down, but they're going to put 5 pipelines down. I'm like, on top of each other. And she's like, which, as we all know, would make no sense whatsoever. And then the best part of it was she says, then they're going to export all this oil to China. And I was like, really? And she said, But if it doesn't work, we know we're costing them about $5 million a day, so that's how she kind of rationalized it. But no, we could not have foreseen such opposition. But I'll tell you, it's now the poster child. Now, we have already submitted, and it's in the newspapers now. I guess I'm not letting the cat out of the bag, but we've done a $600 million upland project, which will be in North Dakota and go to Saskatchewan. It's just been submitted to the State Department for approval. So I'll be curious to see if the same opponents latch on to it as a poster child. But no, TransCanada, the pipeline Keystone has become the poster child, and you would think it's the only pipeline ever built.
You know, I don't know if I get the number right, but I had the good fortune to hear Russ Gerling talk, and he said that there were 33 pipelines or 34 pipelines across the U.S.-Canada border already. So the idea that this one pipeline is really of any material difference than those is pretty incredible.
But you know, we did have the idea, Matt, that we were going to build this pipeline up to the border, and then we could build the Canadian side up to the border and leave a space about this long, and just long enough for a rail car to connect the two, and that would be one way. Yeah, that'd be one way around it. Yeah.
Or you could just use barrels.
Just barrels.
Just carry them. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions?
You know, I could just add to that a little bit. You know, I think what we're seeing at the local level on drilling activity is similar tactics of delay and creating obstructions and trying to use the tactic of cost to delay to scare projects off. And I think what we're hoping the solution to that is that, you know, when we look in, for example, when we survey residents north of Denver, where there's been a lot of opposition to oil and gas, not all that different than the vote that just happened in Denton, we find a pretty standard breakup between 20% of folks who are very supportive of us and probably are employed by us one way or another, 20% of folks who would really like us to have never been born, and then 60% of folks in the middle who are really quite reasonable and would like to learn more and get some comfort around the risks associated with what we're doing. And that risk-benefit conversation with that 60% in the middle is where we've been spending a lot of our time. And that, I imagine that ratio may be a little different in different parts of the country, and it may be nationally probably along those lines, that there's a majority in the middle that doesn't understand our business and is swayed by the hysteric communication tools used by the opposition. And they need some time spent with them. They need to understand, okay, all our energy production has risks associated of all types. What's the best risk-benefit ratio? And can I get behind this project because I understand, okay, I'm an energy consumer. This is the best way for energy to be delivered to me or produced, and I can support it because I understand what's being done. It's an enormous amount of, to your point earlier, it's an enormous amount of effort that has to go into that, whether you're educating a legislator or you're educating a resident. But unfortunately for our industry, and I think we've managed to avoid doing a lot of that in the past, going forward, that's going to be critical in order for us to get these projects done.
Any more questions? Yes.
I think you tried to ask it earlier about this. There's 40% that still, we have 40%.
Right.
But looking at it another way, I've seen numbers from INGA, like 640 billion is needed in infrastructure over the next 25 years. IHS says something like it's 40 to 50 billion a year for the next 10 years, and then thereafter, 30 billion. But whatever it is, the magnitudes are anywhere from 40 to 60 billion a year over the next 15 to 25 years. So I guess my question is, that's the need, that's the flip side of that 60% that I think you were trying to ask them about. So given those numbers of INGA and IHS, do any of you see that? Or are you focused in your areas and you don't see this holistic US-wide picture?
You know, that's a good question, and that I had the chance to spend 2 weeks ago, spend 3 days in D.C. with the Ports to Plains Alliance, and I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they're a Lubbock-based group, and you know, they go up to Colorado and all the way to the Canadian border. But it was really interesting. They were advocating for and it was a no-no to refer to it as a gas tax increase, but if you refer to it as a user fee, a growth of the user fee, that organization is strongly supportive of a substantial increase in highway user fees. I don't think anybody could argue that investment needs to be raised somehow for infrastructure, and I don't know if I don't want to make anybody mad by making any suggestions, but something has to be done for sure. I will say one thing when we talk about the pipelines, and you mentioned the ANGA, if the Keystone Pipeline were built, it would be $172 billion added, that's billion with a B, added to the U.S. gross domestic product by 2035. I mean, that's just money sitting there that could go into that. And just when you think of the opportunities like that, it's, you know, you'd like to see the government taking advantage of that. You guys got any ideas for raising money for infrastructure?
I want to make sure, did we really respond to your question? No. Okay. I liked your answer, by the way. Very, very good. But I think you're focused on, do we see similar?
CapEx over the decades.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is that there's significant, let's not argue on what the number is, but huge numbers of capital required on infrastructure over the next, you know, long period of time. And a lot of that will be for things we've talked about here on infrastructure that will support exports, but you got regulatory hurdles. Infrastructure that will increase demand to the markets with low gas prices. You're going to have greater petrochemical, industrial type of plants and facilities that need gas delivered to them. But they're going to be in a lot of different places, and I think what that does is it lets each of the individual companies decide where they want to play and how they want to spend their money. But it's encouraging to us in the midstream space because there is so many opportunities, and from time to time as prices improve and returns improve, you're going to be able to broaden your footprint. Right now you got to kind of be a little more disciplined in where you're going to grow organically, what you're going to acquire, and things of that nature. But I think the news is clearly there's lots of opportunities for infrastructure and lots of capital needed for it.
Yeah, just to underline that from someone who knows nothing about it, which you take this for what it's worth, I don't know whether those numbers are the right numbers or not, but I would argue that what we didn't know 5 years ago leads me to believe that we have no idea what we're not going to know 10 years from now. And when you look that far down the road into the CapEx investment needs, I would argue those are probably low numbers because of what we don't know. And what we do know is that we keep getting better at this stuff every day. We're able to drive supply costs down because the technology and the efficiency associated with our production process keeps getting better and better. That means that resources that we couldn't go after today, 5-10 years from now, we will be able to go after. They may be located in completely different places, which means a whole new midstream need that maybe we didn't even consider today, that down the road may seem completely obvious. I mean, we wouldn't have thought of the Marcellus being what it is 10 years ago. Who knows what it is 10 years from now? So my gut would tell me that most of the estimates would probably be biased to the low side because this thing just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Well, I think we have time for one more question. Yeah. Yes.
Matt, I have a question for you. It's a bit of a wild card. I started my career in oil and gas and transitioned into a business development role at a renewable energy company. And you spoke about Colorado and some of the challenges you guys have there. You also spoke about products, different products for different markets. And I was just wondering if maybe, you know, integrating some sort of renewable energy collaboration with oil and gas in a market like Colorado, if that would prove favorable from both a regulatory and a community engagement standpoint. Do you know if there's any, conversation maybe internally within Canada or elsewhere in the industry for that type of integration?
Are you thinking along the lines of an integrated renewable company with a portfolio that's got fossil fuels and renewables in it?
Sure, that's one point. Or, from a bottom line standpoint, putting solar panels, for example, on well pad sites that have, are already producing, and really a perfect site for panels because they've already been brushed and cleared, and there's already electrical lines running out there. So, just some food for thought, and would like some feedback.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I actually spent some of my career in the wind industry and in the power industry where we had coal, gas, and wind and solar resources. So I got some experience looking at all those things and how they interrelate to each other in an integrated portfolio. And it's interesting, I have thought about that. And just one thing to keep in mind is that our industry and our company is typical. We're enormous users of things like solar panels in our operations. We're one of the biggest buyers of those types of technologies in the commercial space because they're so ideal for providing pad site power. But what we do find is that the lands where we're developing, like as you pointed out, that you may have cleared sites, but we don't generally have transmission line and power line access or utility scale space to do those types of things. And actually the way our industry's been going is our footprint's been getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So now we may, instead of drilling 50 wells across a 100-acre area, we'll just take a 5-acre section and drill 100 wells or 50 wells from one large pad. So our footprint keeps shrinking, and our interconnectability, like to the power grid, would be very poor. But what we do find is that we like to think that our industry, particularly the gas side of what we do, is the critical enabler to distributed generation, particularly intermittent power sources like wind and solar. So without the fast start capability of natural gas power sources, you could not have wind or solar because you wouldn't have another resource that can come up very quickly when needed in order to replace that power when it gets cloudy or the wind stops blowing. We've seen that here in Texas, how big a deal that really can be as you get to higher and higher penetrations of wind into the grid. So we like to think that we already play a partnership role with renewable power. Interestingly, the financial dynamics of a wind project versus a gas project, ironically, are not all that different. When I was in the power business, one of the most attractive things about a wind project was you got your cash back pretty quickly. It happens for a completely different reason in one business versus another. In the wind industry, you get that cash back pretty quickly, largely because of incentives and credits, whereas in the gas industry, in oil, you get the cash back quickly because you produce most of the life of the well in the first year or two. But there is some synergy there, but I haven't seen anyone make that leap, and largely it's because the infrastructure and the technology needs are just so different.
Well, I think that about does it for our panel, but thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And yes, stay tuned for the final panel.